Thank you, Stesha. Thank you, most of all, to all of you for being here tonight. It is just a joy to look out and see so many friends. Some of you in the audience actually have been along for some of this ride. You maybe saw yourselves in the pictures. This is just a sample of what the last 3 years reporting this book have been like. I've been all over the Northwest, across the border into BC, all the way over into the east of the country to tell this story that I'm going to bring to you this evening. It's just a moment to say thank you, though, also to the Seattle Public Library, which I treasure, to my employer, the Seattle Times. We make your journalism for you, fresh, local, every day. Craft brewed, not industrial. The Blevin family has been publishing the paper through 5 generations since 1886. I'm so lucky to work there. I've been there for 27 years and 40 years as a daily newspaper reporter, so this Pulitzer thing, you know, it was exciting. It was fun. I couldn't figure out why my phone was ringing so much. It's like, God, someone's really trying to get a hold of me. And I want to say thank you to Elliott Bay Books for being here tonight, you know, local bookstores, libraries, supporting local writers, and you, the community, coming out to hear our stories. And this is what keeps us connected, and it's just very, very precious to me. Seattle is a special town, and this is one of the ways in which it's most special. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. I want to just kind of fly through the book quickly because Rena and I want to talk to you, but I thought, well, people need to know, like, well, what are we talking about? So I'm going to quickly take you through this story. So buckle up. Here we go. So we all love wood. We all need wood. I live in a house that was built in 1910 with giant wood. I'm a complete and utter wood pig. My husband will attest to this. I burn wood. I write with a pencil on paper. I work at a newspaper, for heaven's sakes. I write books. So I get it. I was very lucky. I was raised in a place with 7 acres of woods, and my mom would say every day, go outside and find something to do. And every picture of me as a kid, I've got a black eye, and I'm covered with calamine lotion. I'm in my Girl Scout shorts. So, you know, and we burned wood like crazy. We split wood, we stacked wood. I love wood. And so, you know, this story for me is both a story of love and grief. I began this book because I have long revered Jerry Franklin. He's one of the world's foremost ecological geniuses, but his particular focus is old growth trees. He was the one who really brought us the understanding that old growth is a thing, that these older trees are not just bigger, they have special attributes. Old and mature forests are, they're unique in our world. And so I was talking to Jerry actually for a story at the paper, and I said, hey, Jerry, what are you working on? He said, oh, I've got this idea for a new book. It's going to be about old trees and what they taught me for the general public. And I thought, that is a great idea, and he'll never do it. So I called him up a couple weeks later, and I said, hey, that sounds fun. Why don't we do it together? And he thought that was a great idea, and so we started out that way, and then I got a call after our proposal from Nicole Mitchell at the University of Washington Press, the director. She's quite a diplomat. Here's what she said: I think you need to write it. You know, sole author. So I thought, oh God, this is kind of a tough call. So I called him up and I said, I think I need to write it, and would that be okay? Well, he was really glad. He was delighted. He didn't want to write it. He just wanted to team up. So we did. You know, this is what I thought I was going to do on this book. We went and we saw the luscious old growth of the Pacific Northwest, you know, these incredible forests, the giant trees, the 1,000-year-old trees. And, you know, here we are at Cedar Flats Natural Area, and he's talking to me about these trees and how they're so special, so unique, so wonderful. And I'm digging the mushrooms, and I'm loving it. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, this is exactly where I went on my leave. Thank you, Ben, my editor at the Seattle Times back there. You know, but amid all the beauty, amid all the wonder, was the inescapable fact that there's so little of it left. And for me, the day this book changed, the book that I thought I was writing completely vaporized. It wasn't only about this, trees like this, science about the trees like this, all the wonder of even the soil that a forest like this makes. It became about this. You know, we left Cedar Flats Natural Area and went just a couple miles down the road. This is in the Gifford Pinchot Natural Forest. And that's Jerry going off, basically. He's a soft-spoken guy, but when we came into this clear cut, he started to go on about, you know, people need to know all is not well. This industrial forestry model where we, you know, convert a natural forest to basically a crop. It's not okay, and people need to understand it, and I'm not going to shut up about it. I thought, oh, all right. So this book needs to be a very different book, not only about the wonder of old growth and how important it is in old and mature forests, but how we lost so much of them, and how in the Northwest we saved 24 million acres of forests on federal land under the Northwest Forest Plan. But right across the border in BC, same ecology, same precious trees, same salmon depending on these forests, and trees like this are still being cut today, now, 1,000-year-old trees. And I went up to BC to see some of that with Suzanne Simard, who's another famous forest ecologist. One of her breakthroughs was looking at really the relationships between trees, how they actually not only compete with one another, but help one another and even communicate between one another. And in my time up there in the forest with her crew, what we were doing, I was watching her and her crew taking data of some of these last unprotected old growth forests, and even looking at the soil, because the soil in a forest like that is very, very different. And meeting Teresa Ryan, one of her leading scientists in her team, who was all about the relationship between the salmon and the trees. And what came through in these conversations with Teresa Ryan, who's Tsimshian, and with some of the other Native people that I worked with up there in British Columbia, and through the teachings in the Big House, which were generously shared with me, is that what we're really talking about when we're talking about forests isn't only about trees. It isn't certainly only about lumber. It's about relationships, and that the relationships between the trees and the salmon, it's not just a woo-woo thing. This is so real. You can see a different color of greenness in the canopy from space when there's been a big salmon run in the Adams River. You can see in the actual rings of the trees, they're fatter during a really big salmon run. You can actually see the signature of marine-derived nutrients, nutrients from the sea that came home to the forest in a fish brought into the woods by bears. So this is a beautiful, intimate, eternal relationship between these beings and between the first people of this place and these beings who knew how to use the forest for thousands of years. Many thousands of years sustainably. This is a tree, a cedar tree with a bark scar. That piece of bark was used for something. It could have been for clothing, it could have been for even babies' diapers. And that bark scar was made many hundreds of years ago. And you can use a tree in a sustainable way. We know from these trees that we see all over the Pacific Northwest. Native people who lived here knew that the living wealth was kept in a living forest for future generations. And I thought to myself, where did this idea come from? That you cut it all down and send it somewhere else, money that goes to somebody else's bank somewhere else. Where did that come from? And so that's what this book then became about. Not only the wealth of the forest, not only the original knowledge systems that stewarded that wealth, but commodification. That was the through line and is the through line of this book. Across 500 years, 3,000 miles, the movement from Maine, which is where this photograph was taken by me of a massive clear cut, all the way across the country and now still in BC. This is what happens when forests are treated basically as places for growing wood, basically as places mostly to make money for distant shareholders. From a small plane, which I rented for this book, this is what the northern forest of Maine looks like corduroy. It doesn't look like a forest. It's been cut and cut and cut and recut, smaller and smaller and smaller. Look how tiny the logs are. Those are about as big around as a coffee can. And that was for the pulp industry. And on the Penobscot River today, which is the second largest river in New England, you see a lot of dead pulp mills. And the wood that was cut for these, to make pulp for these mills, is what leaves us with these scarred forests. Many communities today are home to these dead pulp mills, and they're looking for a way forward. it's going to be difficult, but a lot of them are trying, as many of our natural resource towns are trying to remake themselves. So I didn't want the book only to be about loss and about trouble. I wanted it also to be about hope, and that's where Molly London, Logger of the Year, comes in. That's Molly right there with her newest baby in the cab of her processor. Now, this is a very expensive piece of equipment that she and her husband managed to buy for their independent logging company, and it makes sure they're cutting the woods, but what they're doing is actually what's called a pre-commercial thinning. Try to take out small stuff so that the trees they leave behind get bigger. And believe it or not, their biggest client is the Appalachian Mountain Club, an outdoor club that is setting aside land for wilderness forever, providing other land for recreation access, and then rehabilitating it with logging practices like these, using local people and their local knowledge. And what I loved about this was spending the time in the cab with this logger and watching how he does his job and understanding that, you know, we all need wood products, and how are we going to get those products more responsibly? And what came home to me was this idea that we need to bring back the original stewardship of these lands, this sense of connection to our forests. We need to be local about our forests the way we are about our food. Think about, where do our wood products come from? How is that wood cut? We need to reconnect our rivers and our forests. In Maine, I was happy to see the beginnings of fish passage on a river, the Penobscot, that was completely taken over for basically the pulp industry, with many dams to create hydropower and to power the dams, and also to basically sluice the logs, turning the river into a sluiceway for logs. Well, this funny looking thing is it's an elevator for fish to get them over one of the dams. But happily, some of the dams, just like in the Elwha, just like in the Klamath, just like in the in other rivers that are still waiting out there for their rehabilitation, these dams are coming down. This is the site of the former VZ Dam. And to sit there on a spring night and look across the Penobscot River and smell the shadbush and see the lavender light of the coming evening and know that those fish are coming back upriver, Atlantic salmon, millions of Atlantic herring, is to know that nature, if you give it a chance, actually does come back. That's an Atlantic salmon. They're trying to do with their Atlantic salmon the same thing we're doing with our Pacific salmon. And I was so struck as a reporter who spent so much time on salmon and rivers in the Pacific Northwest by the unity, the connectedness of these stories, and the connectedness of all of us in this quest to use what we need to use responsibly, to restore these beautiful places that we love, and stop breaking more. Here you see a couple of scientists I went out with on the Penobscot River. This is a river that was so polluted it turned colors. Today, all kinds of creatures are coming back to that river. But I think the part I liked the best was this rather modest accomplishment that actually is quite big. This is what's happening all over the Penobscot watershed, where former culverts are being taken out and being replaced with better bridges for better fish passage. So does this sound familiar? The thing that I love about this is the people who are doing this work never thought that they'd be even thinking about trying to bring fish back that have been gone for a century. And the people doing the work are some of the very same people who built the logging roads. This is Molly London's father-in-law, and he's so proud of every single one of these bridges that he's building. He signs them with welding bead. So that's what it's about. It's about change, it's about transition, and honestly, it's about bravery, each and all of us, to stand up for these forests, to stand up for these places that we love. And with that, Rena and I are going to have a nice, juicy chat.
So, tangan nistralacha o helixen quanosat latiakaias sohaltanat sanasnat chachlamisan. Thank you, Lynda, for inviting me to talk to you tonight about your beautiful book. And, you know, as I was reading it, it's just, I went through so many emotions, you know, because, you know, you really render the landscape so beautifully. And it's like you're there in this forest, but then you talk about what's at stake. And so then, you know, you just go through this like emotional roller coaster of being like, oh, it's so beautiful, and then just, oh, you know, oh, what are we doing here? And so I really appreciated, though, how you really shared what was at stake. And in the early passages, where you're talking about the nurse logs, I really loved how you describe the life that springs out of the things that people think are dead, and that the tree itself is just mostly just dead wood, like it's dead underneath that surface layer, but that the nurse logs, the fallen trees, are hosts to just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species. So will you share about the idea of the forest, the old growth forest, as biodeserts initially, right? The science and all
Right.
that.
So this is the thing that was shocking to me in talking to Jerry, who's, his initial work goes back to much earlier time, the 60s, the 50s, the 70s, the 80s, when actually the idea was to get rid of this decadent old growth as quickly as possible. This was regarded as a desert, an unproductive place. Get rid of that old stuff and make room for thrifty young stands. I mean, personally, I'm offended as a older tree myself. So here's Jerry, who's basically a curious person with an open mind, and he's noticing a lot of things about the forest. For instance, all the dead wood in the forest, logs everywhere. In an old-growth forest, you can't walk in a straight line. There's everything in the way, and in the most glorious way. And unlike all this sort of formal bench science and experiments that were typical of the East Coast colleges, where all the textbooks are being written about these forests and how they work and so forth, he was being instructed by the forest itself and understanding its richness and being curious about how it really worked. And to me, that was just so exciting, because that idea of the humility behind that, to think the forest could teach you something, the idea of seeing the complexity of the living place and the arrogance that you could just replace that with, a monoculture of all the same trees, all the same age, that was going to be just as good. In fact, it would be efficient.
Ugh.
And it was for making capital, right? For making lots of money for distant people. But if you're talking about biodiversity, if you're talking about water quality, if you're talking about species, if you're talking about human well-being, you're talking about something else. You're talking about a forest. And a farm is not a forest. And the nurse log is a perfect example. What you're really seeing there is the ability of the forest to regenerate itself eternally, just as the returning salmon coming back and back and back. These cycles, these beautiful productive systems, self-maintaining, abundant, rich, they will go on forever if you just allow them to keep their own capacity for renewal. In the forest, that means you don't cut it all down. That means you don't put herbicide all over it and burn whatever's left and then plant a monoculture. It can never recover to become a true living forest.
Yeah.
Sorry. Welcome.
So I'm going to read a little passage, because we were talking about poetry, and this felt poetic, like I say, as I was reading your book many times. I thought, oh, that's so beautiful. Living dead, these words don't really make sense in an old-growth forest of the Pacific Northwest, where a live tree is mostly dead, but for the growing live layer of cells under its bark called cambium. And what does dead mean for a decomposing log that holds even more living beings than this tree did when it was alive? And then, that's just like this whole passage here is one of my favorite passages. It's just beautiful. And then when you're talking about the relationship between hydrology in the forest, thinking about how the rivers, well, you and I had talked about the Andrews Forest and the work that they're doing there, studying like how these systems work together.
Right.
I talked to a scientist from the Andrews Forest for a book that is coming out in the fall, and he shared that what's the name of the network? The Wood Wide Web, but it has a technical term.
Mycorrhizal fungi.
There we go, mycorrhizal fungi. The way that works is, in theory, he has this theory that a fish trying to spawn could send out a signal into the forest that there was nowhere to spawn, and that the tree could potentially hear this fish in distress and fell a part of its, a branch or whatever over the part of the river that the fish needed to spawn in to create an eddy there just for this fish. And this relationship of the beings in the forest that hear each other and react to each other and relate to each other is so beautiful. I love that idea. But will you share about Suzanne Simard? Did I say that her name right?
You did.
Yeah, about how her work. It's just that was a fun part of the book.
Sure. So Suzanne is a brave scientist. She works up in BC, and I spent a bunch of time with her for the newspaper writing about the Fairy Creek blockades, and perhaps you followed that in the paper, these protests about the cutting of old growth up there. And I went back to spend more time with her in the woods for this book, a week actually. And what she's doing, I think, is so interesting because she's really looking at the soil in the forest, which is really the last wilderness. We don't know much about what's going on down there. And I want to be clear, her work has been attacked. She's taken a lot of criticism for her work. There's a lot of skepticism about her work. And she is persisting. She's continuing with her work to probe, to experiment, to understand exactly how trees are actually connected as a community and sustain one another. Don't just compete with one another. And what I hear from other scientists is, they dig it, they get that, they believe that. They know that trees support one another. Where they go off the rails is when any kind of intentionality is brought into the conversation. Like, well, they're not deliberately doing it, it's just happening. And it's just so interesting. I'm trained to listen to people, and I so often wish that the people that I'm listening to separately would talk to one another. You guys have the fight and let me listen in, So that's what that science is that she's persisting with. And, I have so much respect for her. She really went through a lot because she was working for BC Timber when she started, and she was curious why the trees weren't growing really well. Because they were being planted in a monoculture. They didn't have any of their companion plants. They didn't have any of the mycorrhizal fungi because that had been burned off, herbicided, scraped away, and they just weren't thriving. So like any good scientist, she was curious about what's missing. And that's when she started doing these experiments where she would literally put a hood over one tree so it can't photosynthesize, and it's next to another tree which is photosynthesizing. And then she would use radioactive isotopes to notice some of the photosynthate from over here. What do you know? It's over here. How did it get there? It came over through the mycorrhizal fungi. So that was the beginning of her work. And it's just, to me, one of the people often ask me, how did you get into being an environmental reporter? What interests you about it? It's exactly that. It's these myriad beautiful connections between species, between processes. For me, it's endlessly interesting. The more you know, the more beautiful it is. But frankly, the more humble you are about messing with it. And as a human who needs and uses things, lives in a house, keep my money in a bank, all the usual stuff, it just makes me want to know more about how we can do that more carefully. Because everything that was here before and all the people who were here before are still here. And they're trying to survive among billions of us in a changing climate, hotter, drier. I think one of the messages of this book has so many characters in it, so many people, so many places, but one of the main messages I want people to know is this business about logging is actually a little bit of a sideshow at this point. It almost seems quaint to me as a question. That at least is within our control. It's a dial we can turn on and off. This other stuff, climate change, hot drought, bugs, fire, disease, these are cycles of destruction we have set in motion by doing nothing, next to nothing, about climate change, with our uncontrolled global commerce bringing in all kinds of pests and diseases. In the East Coast, we are losing entire species. Ash trees, used by the native people there for basket work, the oldest art form in New England. They don't know if they're going to have ash trees for the next generation. Eastern hemlock, it's going away. Why? The hemlock woolly adelgid, it came in on packing material. It's the thing I want you to know is that I worked with scientists working in forests in late stages of decline in protected areas, parks, reserves. It's not about logging there. It's about these changes in our world that we have set in motion. So this is about us, and it's about how we will change our behavior so that these beautiful systems that know how to do what they know how to do and are so beautifully interconnected, if they are allowed to persist.
Yeah, we're all still interconnected.
Yes, and we're so interconnected to it. And, you know, the subtitle of this book, Dispatches from the Salmon Forest, I mean, it was kind of a shock to me to encounter these people 3,000 miles away doing the same thing we're doing, taking down dams, trying to bring back salmon, because they have the same problems we do of having cut it all down and trying to bring it all back. Just started earlier.
Yeah. Gosh, I got to tell you, this is a little side note, but when I was reading this, I was also following the Canadian elections and how they're responding to the tariffs.
Yeah.
And I was just so like, oh, listen, Mark Carney, he's so smart. And then he started on his thing about build, baby, build.
Oh.
And then I thought, oh no, and he was talking about taking down the forest. You know, we're going to do it with our own timber. And it was like, oh, like thinking about how we're interconnected, you know, like what we have somewhat created up, you know, economically in another country. And then I read your quote in here from Teresa Ryan. And after you talk about that beautiful old growth, visiting that beautiful old growth forest that they're cutting down in Canada, she says, anything in this district can be logged and will be. Oh my God, it just ripped my heart out.
Yeah.
So I think, what is my question? I think that it's important to acknowledge that so the Indigenous role in stewardship. And, you know, when people would ask Lee Miracle, who's writing I Love, when they would say, what can we do? You know, what can we do? She would say, well, we have laws that we live by, and you're not exempt from them. That's what you can do. You're still disobeying the laws of the original peoples when these forests come down like that. And I think that, you know, we know that it's wrong, the forestry practices that we engage in, because, you know, the thing that stuck out to me in this book too is the beauty strip. Will you tell us about the beauty strip?
The beauty strip. Yeah, so a lot of you have traveled to Vancouver Island just like I do, and when you're going along that main highway, you're getting the beauty strip. So it looks okay, right? It looks fine. You're basically driving through a tunnel of tall trees. We also see this on the Olympic Peninsula. It's all over New England. This is the little fig leaf over the action, right? I mean, you get up either with a drone or in a plane, as I did, and the truth is revealed.
Right.
And honestly, it's shocking. I mean, when you go up in a small plane over the northern forest of Maine, which is like 10 million acres of privately owned forest, if you can wrap your mind around that, basically it looks like one kind of clear cut or another for as far as you can see. And that's quite a sight.
Yeah.
I mean, our action out here on the Olympic Peninsula is pretty impressive too. Josh Wright, who's here tonight, forest activist extraordinaire, he sent me a photo that he took from a plane over the Olympic Peninsula just a couple days ago. And, you know, none of us should be shocked by this. We all live with the benefits of these wood products. Right. All that I ask is that we care about the workers, number one. They're not throwaways. We care about the forests. They're not throwaways. And we figure out how to do this more carefully and more intelligently. We're trying to do it for food. We need to do it for wood. We did a big series in the paper recently. It's called Forest Feud, where we very deliberately ran into the complexity of this story. Rather than write about how great trees are and how awful logging is, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to go meet people who actually cut trees for a living. We wanted to go to a plywood mill. We wanted to meet the families that are supported by these jobs. And encounter the reality of the world that we've built for ourselves. We all rely on these systems, and we rely on these forests, we rely on these products. And in that series of stories, you know, what I really think came out is that we all live here together now, and we need to make this work for everybody. The rural people, the city people who mainly recreate in the woods. So that's the heart I have for it. I can't hold up a solution other than the bravery of a lot of small communities that I did visit and people that I talked with there who are trying to do things differently in their place. There's not going to be any one-size solution. It has to be locally driven, locally understood, and locally executed. And it's not unlike what we're doing with salmon. I mean, we have so many of these beautiful local recovery groups that are working hard, but you also have to have policy, higher ranking policy in order to set things right. And if you look at our forests here in Washington State, just for example, you know, most of the forest lands are privately owned and industrially managed. On the face of a clock, it would be from 6 till 2. And then you've got a little bit of the state, you've got some federal lands, and a little bit of a much smaller bit of tribal lands. So, you know, the big action is on the industrially managed private lands, and we don't hear much about them, do we?
No.
No.
I really loved how you really talked about, well, the one section where you were talking about the community that is so polluted and so in the hole with the forest, the destructive forestry practices, and then the pulp mill practices, and then just kind of like abandoning them with this big problem. But I loved that their solution is just to start a whole bunch of nonprofits to try to get as much money as they can to kind of like focus on every little thing. It was just hopeful in a way that, you know, people are trying so hard and so efficiently, and just, you know, kind of like throwing everything they've got at it with, I'm going to read that part too, because we're running down on time, but this is my favorite part of this book, is this passage right here.
I can't wait. I wonder if it's one I like.
So this is an elder from the Penobscot Nation. He talks before this, saying this about everybody kind of fighting and splitting hairs and, you know, word choice and in policy and everything, and that he went to a meeting and looked each one of them in the eye and said, this is, you know, this is what you're here for. But then he says, that is the lesson, that is what matters most. One aspect of this was to show that if people want to work together, they can. That was the big thing that gave me hope, that a group of dedicated people can come together to try to fix something. That is what you can learn from the Penobscot Project, that if people put their differences aside and work on what they have in common, have a common vision to do, so many people came together with a vision for the future health of the watershed. The benefits go beyond the river to the larger landscape. It's bearing fruit. People are starting to come around to understand there are other values with the forest other than just making money cutting trees. And so I think that that message is kind of what you come to again and again in this book. And I wondered, one last question is, I wondered if, you know, this kind of reckoning is hard, and I wondered if you got any pushback, like, and how that might have come about or come to you.
Yeah, I mean, when you do what I do, as a newspaper reporter and as a writer, I actually look for conflict, because that's very often, you know, you have to kind of go into the fire. That's where the reality is, and that's where the answers often are. So in this situation also, when I'm working over on the East Coast, I'm kind of a stranger, right? I don't know anybody. So I thought what I would do is I would introduce myself starting out at the University of Maine in Orono and tell them who I was and what I was trying to do. And that's how I met the Londons, Logger of the Year. I was so grateful for them because, you know, it's a lot of trust to bring a reporter, a writer out into your job and introduce that person to your crew, the people that you care about who are doing this job for you that is, you know, it's your whole livelihood. She let me spend the whole day with their people, and I think there's something really magical that happens when people get to meet face to face. Now, who knows what they thought about the media before they met me? And who knows what I thought about loggers, capital L, before I met them? But in that face-to-face, those conversations where we actually spend time together and become frankly amazed at what the other person knows how to do and has even just lived through. You know, for me, those were transformational moments because they are based in respect, mutual respect. So it felt to me that this work of getting to know one another is probably really actually at the base of all the other work that we need to do. And I'm feeling that particularly now. And I think that, you know, in terms of pushback, I'm always determined not to stop there and keep going, because I just still believe that it's possible to keep going and get to a better place, a better conversation.
That's beautiful. So I think we are here at the, unless there's, do you have anything that I didn't bring up that you want to share about?
Well, of course, there are all these things I'm dying to read. I want to go back to where we started and talk a little bit about modesty and humility. Modesty and humility. Being willing to be instructed by the forest. This is Jerry Franklin talking, and he's talking about learning about something nobody thought mattered. Dead wood. We learned by looking at the old forest. That is how we were taught. And the richness and the complexity of it also taught us to be humble. It was a tremendous object lesson in humility and respect, as well as knowledge. The lessons in terms of knowledge, but also lessons in terms of you have to be pretty arrogant to just assume this is nothing more than a source of wood, and you can essentially duplicate it by planting rows of trees. We took a lot of shit from ecologists that thought this was just a hobby thing. We had a lot of negative feedback on the dead wood work, attacking it as just hobby stuff that had no relevance to science. A place like Harvard would have nothing to do with it. It wasn't the sexy sort of stuff, the hypothesis testing the academic scientists are so excited about. I was often angry at the Eastern ecological community, the ones writing all the papers, writing all the textbooks. What they were writing wasn't taking account of the forests that I was in, and I was bound and determined that one of the things I was going to do was to see these theoreticians have to take account of these forests. We established it was an important structural element of the forest. It has to do with mortality of trees, not just leaf fall or branch fall. That means an investment of time. That's the end of his quote. This lack of respect for time is what's wrong with industrial clear-cuts, Franklin found. The plantation-style forestry that robs everything the old trees had taught him was important. The herbicide that kills the young growing understory that feeds the soil. The replacing with a monoculture that will never have the complexity of structure, age, or species of a true natural forest. These conversions of natural old forests to plantations were stealing from the future. These once naturally forested sites were now croplands that could never become the old growth of tomorrow. Quote, I refer to plantations as one of forestry's great deceptions, Franklin said. Quote, we were fooled. People have to realize that all is not well. Foresters deceived themselves into thinking plantations are forests, and they are not. These are great for the stockholders, but nobody else. So the trees are speaking. There's so much in here that I hope you will enjoy. So many people, so much science, yes, it's true, but also a lot of just quiet listening and looking and description of the forest. But the trees are speaking, but now I want to hear you all speak. We want to take your questions. Ready?
So as they make their way up with the mics, I just want to say really quick that Samard's, there's a video about Samard's Wood Wide Web together with my poem, The Forest for the Trees, on poets.org in their section, Teach This Poem. So another little like relationship between the poetry theme that she was mentioning earlier and this. So, yeah.
Asiam Nishchacha, Amy Sinisna, Chowashamish, Bert Saas. Hello, everyone. So, my name is Amy, and I'm a member of the Samish Indian Nation. And I think that there's been challenges to forests not since 1952, not since 1852, but since 1492 in this continent. And I think, you know, I often say that I'm on like cedar tree time, right? Because we know that there's generations and generations of like cedar trees like that are impacting people. And I think one of my questions for you, and you know, you said one of your teachings through this was humility, but how do you talk to people who are stubbornly or fearfully ignorant and obstinately so? And like how can you teach humility when there's been a culture that the basis has been manifest destiny for a very long time?
I think you might be better at answering this than I will be.
So there's one thing that I was going to mention. In this book, Lynda talks about how there's a quote, after 400 years of intensive logging, less than 1% of old growth remains. And, you know, I immediately thought, okay, over 400 years of intensive logging, less than 1% of old growth remains. There are less than 1% of indigenous peoples in the United States of America after 400 years of colonization. And I feel like that should be a direct, I mean, because we always say, you know, at Lummi, thinking about the orca whales, right? That's an indicator species, and we say what happens to them happens to us. And, you know, if they go, we go. It's the same with the trees. If they go, we go. And I can't think of a more precise correlation than less than 1% of old growth and less than 1% of indigenous peoples in the United States. It's like it demonstrates that completely. And when people resist, because of course people resist, hard things are hard, right? And America's history, the history of the Western Hemisphere, is hard. And I often feel like there's no place for it, for my voice. And so I don't know what the answer is, except I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is. I sometimes feel like I'm shouting into the void. And things like this, my most recent collection of poetry, I can't find a home for it. And people ask me at every reading, when can we get your book? And I think because it deals directly with what you're talking about, manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery, and that papal bull, 1495, and you know, all of the oppressions of religious freedoms of indigenous peoples, I think people don't want to hear, like it's just too hard. There's another passage in this book where an elder talks about his father trying to resist the logging companies, and he was arrested for potlatching, and his children were taken from him. And you know, you talk about like, you talk about, I can't think of, let's see, where is it? Put in jail for potlatching. Oh, elimination of resistance by any means. So if you're standing in the way of somebody making money, they're going to find a way to get rid of you. And you see that in indigenous history over and over and over and over again. So there's no easy answer except to kind of sit in rooms like this and say these things and hope that they fall on compassionate ears, and hopefully ears connected to voices that can share these truths as well. Kaishka.
Yes. Yes, the question was, where do spotted owls fit in your story if they do? Well, I can tell you the only spotted owls I saw were stuffed, which tells you a lot right there. You know, the Northwest Forest Plan, when it was enacted in 1994, was the most sweeping multi-species conservation plan anywhere in the world, 24 million acres, 3 states, on federal lands, to conserve not only the spotted owl, but salmon, of course, and all the other creatures that rely on old-growth forests to clean the water, shade the water, cool the water. Salmon are creatures of the forest. Understand that. If you don't take care of the trees, you're not going to have the fish. You don't have the fish, you're not going to have the orcas. So again, it's back to those connections. The spotted owl at this time is in terrible decline. We overcut the forests, and you know we are seeing recovery in the areas that have not been cut since 1994. But let's face it, we eliminated a lot of their habitat. We've also cooked the climate. So we're having a lot of fires, so we're losing even forests that we set aside. The situation with the spotted owl at this point is it's being driven out by an invasive competitor, the barred owl. The barred owl eats anything, and it requires actually not much space. It breeds more successfully and more often than the poor spotty. And so this animal is being driven from its home. And so at this point, the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, its big plan was to kill off a bunch of barred owls to try to make space for the spotties to revive. That's how bad it is, killing one owl to save another. What does that tell you about where we are? But I don't know what's going to happen now under the new regime. The Northwest Forest Plan is up for an update. Does that make you nervous? It should. And I don't even know if they're going to go forward with this spotted owl and barred owl management plan. Whenever you hear language like that, you know you're not getting any. So I would say to your audience that it really is time to be paying attention. You've been reading the paper, I hope, about all the executive orders coming out of the Trump administration and so forth. Look, we still have the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, all these other national laws are still on the books, and let's wait and see what happens when these first forest sales start coming out of the federal government. What do they really look like? And if it's time to litigate. If it's time to tree sit, there's one going on right now in the Elwha over a state sale, tree sit. This is not a time to sit on your hands, be polite, quiet, or tune out. Great ships are made to sail, not stay in the harbor. Yes, in the big hat, yes. I can hear you. Yes, so the question is, okay, it's not one size fits all, but what could we do? Okay, I never thought I would find a solution at the Appalachian Mountain Club, right? It's a hiking club for many states in New England. It happens to be one of the oldest, largest outdoor clubs in the country. Here's what was so exciting to me about them. They were looking at the land that they care about in New England through multiple lenses. They continue to pay their taxes, even though they are a nonprofit. And they do that mostly for the local community because they know that will be appreciated in impoverished rural communities. Number two, they are setting aside in a very intentional way wildlands and woodlands just to let nature take its course on those lands without intervention by us. There are other lands that they're setting aside and utilizing wonderfully for recreation. They really believe in the connection of people and place, and that this idea of fencing people out of places is a wrong turn. And so they really go out of their way to create very accessible public access to these lands. And finally, and to me most excitingly, they are hiring local people with local knowledge to work in the woods, rehabilitate these horrifically cut over landscapes that are really zombie forests today. They can't reset to natural forests no matter what. They have to be reset by opening them up, making open spaces so that trees can grow bigger. There were a lot of things that struck me about that. The respect for local people, that's where the knowledge was and the skill sets are. The refusing to be sort of stopped by the enormity of the problem, and the determination that the solution for young people in that town wasn't going to be, if you want a future, you can't have it here. You have to go away because we used up our place. There's nothing here for you now. I found that really exciting. It's modest, it's small, but to me it had all the integrity of local concern, care, and participation. And so in terms of bringing back salmon, in terms of reconnecting these maimed landscapes so that they can once again function, I think it's going to be a lot of things like that. But don't fool yourself. It's also going to take national policy. And that's really true about climate. And it's really true about management of these larger public lands, and also, honestly, changing regulations on private lands, so nothing is a throwaway landscape. I mean, right now, the largest amount of forest land in Washington State is really managed for one value: money, private capital, for distant investors. You manage anything for only one outcome, I don't care what it is, it's not going to come out in a balanced, healthy way.
We have time for 2 more questions. I see one down over here. I don't know where Samsia is. Okay, let's take one up there first, and we'll walk to you. Okay.
Thank you both for your comments. Very, very interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, Lynda. It sounds fascinating. I love old growth forests. I spent a lot of time there. And I wanted to, kind of underscore, but also ask a little bit more. Like, my understanding basically is without the Northwest Forest Plan, it's unlikely would have hardly any old growth forest left in this region. I mean, they were cutting like 12 million acres a year or something like that. They were just logging like crazy before it went in. And one of the plans of the Forest Service is actually to change, including in the late successional reserves, change the age of what they can log from 80 to 120 years, which would open up, I think it's 828,000 more acres. And then on top of that, you have Trump targeting all of the national forests in Washington State, including wilderness areas for logging. So given that, and then there's this whole thing with the Forest Service where they're really pushing this whole thing about active management, including thinning forests and so forth, which in a lot of places is just a cover for clear cutting. I know I've talked to people with a group called Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project in Oregon, and they say these are the words that they use, and then they'll just clear cut an area. So how do you see us dealing with this situation? I know litigation is going to happen, and it's important, but I really think that we need to be active. We need to, this forest sit you mentioned, the other things people are doing for legacy forests, but how do you think people need to respond to some of this? Because Trump calls it an emergency. I think it is an emergency from our side, too.
Right. I do think that this is a time to be vigilant, to be engaged, to be paying attention. Right now, there's no specificity to any of this. It's just words on paper and meat for the base. So once those timber sales start coming out of the National Forest offices, let's see what they look like. I mean, look, what's been called for so far is either illegal or impossible because they got rid of most of the people. So I don't really know what this is going to look like, and I don't think any of us knows what it's going to look like. And I would say that it is a time to be doing what the Northwest has always known how to do: pay attention, get involved, work with one another, and stand up for these landscapes. Once they're gone, you don't get them back. I mean, the miracle of what we did with the Northwest Forest Plan is we stopped before it was all gone. In BC, they haven't managed to do that. They're still cutting. It's going to be gone eventually. So do you want to do something before it's all gone?
So we have another question right over here.
I love the old growth forest, but I also appreciate you talking about the clear cuts because I think it's important. When you go on hikes in the mountains, you see both of them. But I'm curious, because most of the talk has been about forests and the big forest, but in any of your research, did you look at the the urban forests and the clear cutting that's happening on lots underdeveloped in cities like Seattle and others across the country.
So, did you all hear the question? This is about the importance of urban forests and the losses of trees in our cities, including in Seattle. And, you know, this is very real. There's a real conflict here between wanting to densify the city to make more housing for more people and losing these beautiful trees in the side yards, losing the side yards themselves. This is a hot mess that we're all right in the middle of with the mayor's plan for rezoning the city, large parts of the city. I live in, my husband and I, Doug, live in Greenwood, and it's one of those neighborhoods where, you know, big gracious old trees change the look of the street, and it's cooler, and it's beautiful because of the trees. And we did some stories at the paper about the effects on, you know, the urban heat islands and how much more intense they are in places in South Seattle and the Rainier Valley where they don't have as many trees. And there's a very direct correlation between higher income zip codes of the city and more tree cover and just better health outcomes than in other parts of the city where they don't have trees. So your point is right on as to equity. It's right on as to human health and, of course, all the other things that matter. Birds. You know, you're not going to have any birds unless you have trees. And I just think that in Seattle, I'm a little shocked, honestly, that we're doing as badly at this as we are. I've been out on too many stories where some heartbroken person is calling me because a gigantic, beautiful something is being cut down in their neighborhood. And usually what we hear as well, it would have cost more to develop the land if we had to keep that tree, and we're past that point, and it wouldn't make our project pencil, et cetera. And somehow when we went through this tree ordinance exercise, we seem to have made it worse rather than better. So I honestly am a little mystified by this. I don't cover city politics, that's not my expertise, but I do know a lot about trees and their value. And I'm not sure why it is that we've done such a good job caring for forests, forestry, clear cuts, all that stuff, but somehow in our own backyard, we're not getting through to the city. I don't understand that. I also care about affordable housing and people having a place to live that's truly a home. And look, if we're smart enough to do all the other things we do, I can't believe we can't figure this out, but we certainly have not. I would agree with you there.